In 1789, a mob of thousands of Parisian women, many of them market vendors and fishwives, armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and a handful of stolen cannons, marched 12 miles through pouring rain from the center of Paris to the gates of the Palace of Versailles. They were not revolutionaries in the ideological sense. They were mothers and wives who had spent that morning in bread lines that led nowhere, staring at empty shelves in bakeries that had nothing left to sell. Bread accounted for roughly 3/4 of the average French worker's diet, and in the months before that march, the price of a loaf had climbed so high that a laborer could spend nearly half of his entire daily wage just to feed his family a single day's ration. By the time the crowd reached the palace gates, it had swollen past 60,000 people. 2 royal bodyguards lost their heads to pikes before the night was through, and King Louis XVI, the so-called Sun King's descendant, was marched back to Paris behind a procession of guardsmen who paraded loaves of bread on the tips of their bayonets. 14 years earlier, in 1775, roughly 300 separate riots had already swept across the towns and villages of northern France. An uprising so widespread that the French crown was forced to deploy 25,000 troops just to reopen the markets. Historians would later give it a name almost too on the nose to believe: the Flour War. And nearly 2 centuries after that, in 1977, a very different government on a very different continent would learn the exact same lesson. Egypt's president ordered the price of subsidized bread raised as part of an economic reform package, and within 48 hours, riots that left an estimated 80 people dead had spread through every major city in the country, forcing the government to reverse the decision within 2 days. 3 different centuries, 3 different governments, 3 different flags. But there is one cause running underneath every single one of them, and it is not politics, and it is not ideology. Bread. A food you can buy today at any grocery store for around $3 a loaf, sliced, bagged, and barely worth a second thought as you toss it into your cart. Governments have fallen because of it. Kings have been marched to their deaths because of it. Empires have restructured their entire tax systems around it. So how did a mixture of ground grain, water, and yeast become the single most politically dangerous food in human history? The one substance that, more than any currency, more than any weapon, has decided whether a government stood or fell. That story does not begin in Paris or in Cairo. It begins almost 10,000 years earlier, in a stretch of land most people today could not find on a map. The region is called the Fertile Crescent, a curved band of territory running through what is now Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the Levant. And it was there, roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era, that a wild grass first caught human attention. That grass was wild wheat, specifically varieties known as einkorn and emmer, and it grew in dense, self-seeding stands across the hillsides of the region, most heavily in an area historians now call the Levantine Corridor. Long before anyone understood the concept of agriculture, hunter-gatherer communities were already gathering the seed heads of these wild grasses, grinding them between flat stones, and mixing the resulting flour with water to make a coarse, unleavened paste that could be cooked on a hot stone or in embers. Archaeological evidence recovered from a site in northeastern Jordan called Shubaika suggests that something resembling bread, in the form of charred crumbs, existed as early as roughly 14,000 years ago, which would place bread before agriculture itself. Think about that for a second. Humans were baking bread before they had even domesticated the plants they were baking it from. They did not know the word genetics. They were doing it anyway, selecting, generation after generation, the grass heads that held their seeds longest, that produced the biggest kernels, that were easiest to harvest by hand. Over roughly 2,000 years, this slow, patient, and entirely unscientific process of selection transformed a scrappy, wild grass into domesticated wheat, a plant that, unlike its wild ancestor, would not shatter and scatter its seeds onto the ground the moment it ripened. It stood there, waiting to be cut. That single trait, a mutation that in the wild would have been a disadvantage since it made the plant worse at spreading its own seed, was exactly what made it valuable to humans. Farmers kept it alive by planting the seed themselves. Somewhere in that process, agriculture as we understand it was born, and bread was very likely the reason. The earliest loaves would not have looked or tasted anything like what comes out of a modern oven. They were flat, dense, and gritty, often containing tiny fragments of the grinding stone itself, worn away by the friction of milling and swallowed along with the meal. Archaeologists studying ancient teeth from this period have found grinding stone particles embedded so consistently in the enamel that dental wear patterns are now used as a kind of forensic evidence for how heavily a population depended on ground grain. Leavened bread, the airy, risen kind most people picture today, came later, and almost certainly by accident. Somewhere in the ancient world, most likely in Egypt, a batch of wet dough was left out longer than intended, long enough for wild, airborne yeast to settle into it and begin fermenting on its own. Rather than throwing the dough away, someone baked it anyway, and discovered that it produced a lighter, softer loaf than anything made before. There is no single named inventor of leavened bread. There could not be. It was not one great historical genius who was suddenly credited. It was, most likely, the accumulated trial and error of countless anonymous bakers, most of them women, working over generations, none of whom ever knew they were interacting with a living microorganism at all. The first great civilization to build itself, quite literally, on top of bread was ancient Egypt. The Egyptians did not just eat bread, they industrialized it, and they used it as the backbone of an entire economic and religious system. Egyptian laborers, including the workers who built the pyramids at Giza, were paid not in coin, but in rations of bread and beer, both made from the same emmer wheat and barley that filled the granaries along the Nile. Archaeologists estimate that ancient Egyptian workers might consume as much as a gallon of beer and several loaves of bread a day as part of their standard wage, a detail that upends the popular image of the pyramid builder as an enslaved laborer. These were, for the most part, paid workers, and bread was the currency. The Egyptians developed dozens of distinct bread shapes and recipes, some baked in tall conical molds, some flattened, some sweetened with dates or honey, shapes that would have terrified a modern grocery shopper trying to figure out which aisle they belonged in. Bread was so central to Egyptian identity that the Greeks, who traded with and later conquered Egypt, took to calling the Egyptians artophagoi, roughly translating to bread eaters, a nickname that was not exactly a compliment but stuck for centuries. Bread was baked into Egyptian religion as well. Loaves were left in tombs as offerings for the dead to eat in the afterlife, and the pharaoh himself was frequently depicted in temple reliefs presenting bread to the gods as a symbol of the nation's abundance and his own divine responsibility to provide for his people. This is a detail worth sitting with, because it sets up a pattern that would repeat for the next 5,000 years. The ruler's legitimacy was tied to the price and availability of bread. When the bread ran out, so, eventually, did the ruler's authority. That pattern found its most explicit expression in ancient Rome. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing around the start of the 2nd century, coined a phrase that has survived nearly 2,000 years: panem et circenses, bread and circuses, a cynical observation that the Roman population could be pacified and controlled with two simple things: free food and free entertainment. This was not a poetic exaggeration. It was closer to a description of actual state policy. The Roman government operated what historians call the cura anninae, a grain dole that by the late Republic distributed subsidized or entirely free grain to as many as 200,000 Roman citizens a month. This program was not charity in the modern sense. It was survival politics. Rome's population had grown far larger than the surrounding Italian countryside could feed, and the city depended on massive grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa, hauled across the Mediterranean by fleets of ships to keep its population from starving and, more importantly to the men in power, from rioting. Roman politicians understood exactly what they were doing. Securing the grain supply, and by extension the price of bread, was one of the fastest ways to secure political power, and disrupting it was one of the fastest ways to lose your head, sometimes literally. When grain shipments were delayed by storms, piracy, or political sabotage, Roman mobs did not hesitate to riot in the forum itself, and more than one Roman official found his career, and occasionally his life, ended by a bread shortage he did not cause and could not fix fast enough. This was not about seasoning food or filling stomachs for its own sake. Bread policy was Roman state security. An empire that could put ships on the Mediterranean and legions on 3 continents still understood that its own capital city was one bad harvest away from open revolt. This is where the story of bread starts to take a turn nobody in the ancient world could have predicted, because the very same food that fed empires would also become one of medieval Europe's most tightly regulated commodities. In England, the price of bread became so politically sensitive that in the year 1266, King Henry III issued a nationwide law known as the Assize of Bread and Ale, one of the very first pieces of food regulation in British legal history. Here is the strange part. The Assize did not fix the price of bread directly. Prices stayed constant. Instead, it adjusted the weight of the loaf according to the price of wheat that week. When grain prices rose, bakers were legally required to sell smaller loaves for the same coin. When grain prices fell, the loaves got bigger. This system of variable weight, fixed price, stayed in force, with revisions, for nearly 6 centuries, an almost unbroken run from the 13th century into the 1700s. Bakers who cheated the system, shaving weight off their loaves to pocket the difference, were subject to public humiliation, fines, and, in repeated cases, a punishment called the tumbrel, essentially being dragged through town on a cart in disgrace. And here is the detail that makes this strange to modern ears. The phrase, baker's dozen, 13 items instead of 12, is widely believed by historians to trace back to this exact law. Bakers, terrified of being caught shortchanging a customer by even a fraction of an ounce and facing serious punishment for it, began throwing in an extra loaf or roll as insurance against the scale. A superstition about generosity was, in reality, a defense mechanism against a government inspector. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, French kings were building their own elaborate systems of grain control, taxing bread indirectly through levies on milling and requiring bakers' guilds to answer to royal officials. Bread had become, across an entire continent, one of the most heavily regulated substances a person could buy, more controlled in some towns than gold or silver changing hands in the marketplace. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because this is the point in the story where bread stops being a matter of regulation and starts becoming a matter of open rebellion. By the 1700s, France had developed what economic historians call a moral economy around grain, an unwritten but deeply held belief among ordinary people that bread had a fair, customary price, and that anyone, merchant, miller, or noble, who tried to profit by pushing that price above what was considered just was committing a kind of theft against the community. This belief was not abstract. It was tested violently in the spring of 1775. A poor harvest the previous autumn had already tightened supplies when King Louis XVI's newly appointed finance minister, Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, made a fateful decision. Turgot was a believer in laissez-faire economics, and he pushed through an edict deregulating the domestic grain trade, removing the price controls and local restrictions that had long governed how grain could be bought, sold, and moved across France. In theory, a free market would encourage more grain to flow to where it was needed most. In practice, it did the opposite. Merchants, sensing an opportunity, began hoarding and speculating, and the price of flour, and with it bread, spiked violently within weeks. Riots broke out first in the small market town of Beaumont-sur-Oise in April, and from there they spread with startling speed. Within a matter of weeks, an estimated 300 separate riots erupted across the Paris basin and beyond, crowds storming mills, granaries, and bakeries, seizing grain, and in many cases forcing merchants to sell it at the old just price rather than looting it outright. This is an important and often overlooked detail. Many of these rioters were not simply looting for themselves. They were enforcing what they believed was the legitimate traditional price, acting almost as an informal, furious version of the very price controls the government had just abolished. The Crown's response was blunt. Turgot deployed 2 armies totaling roughly 25,000 troops to occupy market towns and the surrounding countryside, with a 3rd army garrisoned inside Paris itself, where more than 1,000 bakeries were raided by rioters in a single wave. Order was restored by mid-May, and of the 548 rioters eventually arrested, only 2 were sentenced to death. Historians have given this uprising a name that reads almost like satire: the Flower War. It sounds absurd. It was not. It was a preview, 14 years early, of exactly what would happen when the French monarchy failed this same lesson a second time. By the late 1780s, France's underlying problems had not been solved, they had simply been deferred. A series of poor harvests through the 1780s, worsened by unusual weather patterns that some modern climatologists have connected to a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783, drove grain prices to levels not seen in generations. By the summer of 1789, an ordinary Parisian laborer was spending nearly half of his wages on bread alone, a level of hardship that left almost nothing for rent, clothing, or fuel. The storming of the Bastille that July, an event most people know as the symbolic opening act of the French Revolution, was itself fueled in part by rumors that grain was being deliberately withheld from the poor to benefit the wealthy, a conspiracy theory that spread through Paris that summer with the kind of speed that would look familiar to anyone who has watched a modern rumor spread online. Then, on the morning of October the 5th, 1789, that anger reached its breaking point. Parisian market women, the very people responsible for feeding their families and often for buying bread themselves at dawn to sell throughout the day, found the markets bare and the prices impossible. What began as a crowd of a few thousand outside the Hôtel de Ville, demanding the city release its grain stores, grew within hours into a marching column of somewhere between 60 and 70,000 people, according to most historical estimates. Many of them armed with kitchen knives, pikes, and captured muskets. They marched the 12 miles to Versailles in a driving rain, chanting for bread, and by the following afternoon, they had forced King Louis XVI, Queen Marie Antoinette, and their children to return with them to Paris, where the royal family would live for the next several years under close and increasingly hostile public watch. Now, popular legend holds that Marie Antoinette, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, responded with the phrase, "Let them eat cake." Historians are almost unanimous that she never actually said this. The quote appears in the writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France as a teenage bride, and was likely already an old, recycled anecdote about an unnamed princess long before it was pinned to her specifically. But the fact that the French public was so ready and willing to believe she had said it tells you everything about how deep the resentment over bread had already run. This was not just about seasoning food or filling stomachs. The March on Versailles is widely regarded by historians as the moment the French monarchy lost its remaining independence and authority. The moment the crown was, in a very literal sense, marched home by its own hungry subjects. Bread had not just caused a riot, it had toppled the effective power of a king. France was hardly alone in this. Across the English Channel, bread and grain shortages had triggered their own long history of unrest, from scattered riots in the 16th and 17th centuries to the more organized protests that followed Britain's Corn Laws in the early 1800s. Tariffs on imported grain that kept domestic bread prices artificially high to protect wealthy landowners at the direct expense of the urban poor who could least afford it. The Corn Laws would eventually be repealed in 1846, not out of pure compassion, but under mounting pressure from a growing industrial working class, and, not coincidentally, in the shadow of a famine unfolding across the Irish Sea that made the political costs of expensive bread impossible to ignore any longer. This is where the story of bread takes a turn nobody expected, Because the single most consequential bread riot in modern history was not led by revolutionary agitators, philosophers, or armed militias at all. It was led by exhausted women standing in the freezing cold, waiting for a loaf that was not coming. By the winter of 1917, Russia had been at war for nearly 3 years, and the strain on its food supply had become unbearable. Millions of peasant men, the backbone of the country's agricultural labor force, had been conscripted into the army, and the railway network, already overstretched by military logistics, had all but collapsed under the dual burden of moving troops and moving grain at the same time. In the imperial capital of Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, women were spending hours, sometimes entire days, standing in bread queues that stretched down entire city blocks in temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing, often only to reach the front of the line and find the shelves already empty. One historian described these bread lines as functioning almost like an accidental political forum, a place where women with nothing left to do but wait exchanged rumors, grievances, and, increasingly, open anger at the government of Tsar Nicholas II. On February the 23rd by the old Russian calendar, March the 8th by the Western calendar, a date that happened to fall on International Women's Day, female textile workers in Petrograd's Vyborg district walked out of their factories and into the streets, banging on the windows of neighboring mills and shouting for the men inside to join them. Some accounts describe local Bolshevik organizers actually urging the women to hold off, arguing the moment was not yet ripe for a full demonstration. The women did not listen. By the end of that first day, somewhere between 75,000 and 90,000 workers had joined the strike. Within 2 days, that number had swollen past 200,000, and the crowds were no longer chanting only for bread. They were chanting, "Down with the Tsar," and "Down with the war." Here is the detail that decided the outcome of the entire revolution. When the Tsar ordered troops to fire on the crowds, and in some confrontations soldiers did open fire, killing demonstrators in the street, the army's loyalty began to crack. Cossack cavalry sent to disperse the protesters reportedly smiled at them instead of charging. By the following day, entire garrisons in Petrograd were mutinying, turning their weapons over to the very crowds they had been sent to suppress. Without a loyal army, Tsar Nicholas had nothing left to enforce his authority with. On March 2, 1917, he signed his abdication, ending 300 years of Romanov rule in a matter of 4 days. One historian summarized it about as bluntly as a historian ever does. The February Revolution was born in the bread queue. 300 years of dynasty, 3 centuries of wars won and lost, coronations and conquests, undone not by a foreign army, not by an assassin's bullet, but by women who simply could no longer stand in the cold for a loaf of bread that was not there. And nearly 2 centuries after the Women's March on Versailles, and exactly 60 years after the fall of the Romanovs, a strikingly similar story played out in a country that, on paper, had almost nothing in common with either 18th century France or revolutionary Russia. In January of 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, under pressure from international lenders including the World Bank to reduce government spending, announced a sweeping package of cuts to state subsidies on basic goods, including bread, sugar, and rice, with some prices set to rise by as much as 25 to 50% overnight. In a country where bread is called aish, which is also the Arabic word for life itself, this was never going to be received as a minor fiscal adjustment. Within a single day of the announcement, factory workers in Cairo and Alexandria walked off the job. Within 48 hours, protests and rioting had spread to nearly every major city in the country. The government deployed the army to restore order, and by the time the unrest was suppressed, an estimated 80 people were dead, more than 500 injured, and roughly 1,200 arrested. Sadat's government, facing the very real possibility of collapse, reversed the subsidy cuts within 2 days. This is the part that should make you angry, or at least make you pause. A modern, industrialized government, backed by international financial institutions and a standing army, learned in less than 72 hours the exact same lesson that the French monarchy had learned, fatally, nearly 2 centuries earlier. You do not touch the price of bread. Not because bread is sacred, because bread is survival, and a population that cannot feed itself has nothing left to lose by taking to the streets. This is where the story of bread pivots from politics to machinery, because the very forces that made bread cheap enough, eventually, to stop causing riots in wealthy nations were themselves the product of a century of relentless industrial reinvention. For most of human history, milling grain into flour was slow, labor-intensive work done by hand querns, animal-powered mills, or water wheels that could only serve a limited local population. That began to change dramatically in the late 1700s when an American inventor named Oliver Evans designed and built what is widely credited as the first fully automated flour mill in the United States, a system of conveyors, elevators, and hoppers that allowed grain to move through the entire milling process, from raw kernel to bagged flour, with almost no direct human labor. Evans patented his automated milling system in the 1790s, and though it took decades to spread widely, it planted the seed of an idea that would define the next century of food production: that the labor of feeding a population could be systematically removed from human hands and handed instead to machines. The next major leap came from Europe. In the mid-1800s, Swiss and Hungarian engineers developed what became known as the roller milling process, using paired steel or porcelain rollers to crush wheat kernels in stages, rather than grinding them all at once between heavy millstones. Roller milling produced a finer, whiter, more consistent flour than traditional stone grinding ever could, and crucially, it did so faster and at a far lower cost per unit. By the 1880s, roller mills had spread rapidly through Europe and North America, and the traditional stone-ground grist mill, a technology essentially unchanged since antiquity, was rendered almost obsolete within a single generation. Then came the baking side of the equation. In 1928, an American engineer named Otto Frederick Rohwedder unveiled a machine that could both slice and wrap a loaf of bread automatically, a device that took years of persistence to perfect after an earlier prototype was destroyed in a factory fire. Sliced bread was initially met with skepticism from bakers, who worried that pre-sliced loaves would go stale faster. But consumers loved the convenience almost immediately, and within just a few years, sliced bread had become so widely adopted in American households that it gave rise to a phrase that has now outlived almost everyone who remembers where it came from: the greatest thing since sliced bread. It is worth sitting with the irony here. A food that had triggered revolutions, toppled monarchs, and shaped the tax policy of empires had, within the span of about 150 years of industrialization, been reduced to a punchline for convenience, the baseline unit against which all future consumer inventions would be measured. But bread is far more than just a loaf on a supermarket shelf today, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Modern global wheat production now exceeds 780 million metric tons a year, according to recent United States Department of Agriculture estimates, grown across nearly every inhabited continent, with China, India, Russia, and the United States consistently ranking among the largest producers on Earth. Wheat is not just a food crop anymore. It is one of the most heavily traded commodities in global financial markets, bought and sold on futures exchanges in Chicago and elsewhere by traders who may never see a single stalk of it growing, betting on weather patterns in Kansas or Ukraine months before a single grain is harvested. And here is the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Global wheat and grain markets remain so politically volatile that modern conflicts still ripple directly through bread prices around the world. When Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine disrupted Black Sea shipping routes beginning in 2022, both countries being among the largest wheat exporters on the planet, global wheat prices spiked sharply within weeks, and countries across North Africa and the Middle East, the same region that saw Egypt's bread riots decades earlier and that depends heavily on imported grain, faced renewed fears of exactly the kind of unrest this documentary has spent the last several minutes describing. The pattern has not disappeared. It has simply gone global, connected now by container ships and financial derivatives instead of royal granaries and Roman grain fleets. But the underlying mechanism is identical to the one that marched Louis XVI back to Paris in the rain. When bread becomes unaffordable, governments become unstable. That has been true for roughly 10,000 years, and there is no strong evidence it has stopped being true now. There is a stranger twist to bread's modern story as well, one that has nothing to do with hunger at all. The same wheat gluten that gives bread its chewy structure has, in recent decades, become a genuine source of medical and dietary controversy, with conditions such as celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity driving a global gluten-free food market now estimated to be worth well over $10 billion a year, built almost entirely around avoiding the one ingredient that ancient farmers spent 2,000 years trying to breed into their crops in the first place. Meanwhile, on the scientific frontier, researchers have spent years sequencing the modern bread wheat genome, an unusually complicated task since cultivated wheat is what geneticists call a hexaploid, meaning it carries 6 copies of each chromosome rather than the 2 most animals and plants carry, the accidental result of ancient natural crossbreeding between 3 different wild grass species thousands of years before anyone had a word for genetics at all. And in an irony that would not be out of place in this documentary's opening minutes, some agricultural researchers are now looking at reviving ancient, low-yield wheat varieties like einkorn and emmer, the very same wild grains first gathered on those Fertile Crescent hillsides roughly 10,000 years ago, marketed today in health food stores as a premium, artisanal alternative to the modern wheat that industrial breeding eventually produced. The oldest bread on earth is now being sold, quite literally, as the newest trend. So think back to where this story started. It was there when the first farmers along the hills of the Fertile Crescent slowly, patiently, bred a wild grass into something worth planting. It was there, feeding the laborers who built the pyramids, paid in loaves and beer instead of coin. It was there, in the granaries of Rome, propping up an empire that understood, long before modern political science had a word for it, that a hungry citizen is a dangerous citizen. It was there, in the tumbrils and fines of medieval England, in the baker's dozen born out of fear of a magistrate's scale. It was there, in the 300 riots of the Flower War, and it was there 12 miles down a rain-soaked road to Versailles, marching a king back to his own capital city on the tip of a bayonet. It was there in Cairo in 1977, and it is there today, in the futures markets of Chicago and the disrupted shipping lanes of the Black Sea. And it is there tomorrow morning, most likely, sitting in a bag on your kitchen counter, or toasting quietly while you check your phone, costing you a few dollars and demanding nothing more of your attention than a decision between white or whole wheat. Bread is never just bread. It never was. It has been the difference between a stable government and a fallen one, between a full stomach and a starving one, for longer than most of the institutions we consider permanent have even existed. Not bad for a mixture of ground grain, water, and yeast that nobody, 10,000 years ago on a hillside in the Fertile Crescent, ever expected to end up shaping the fate of empires. If any part of this history surprised you, the Flour War, the myth of let them eat cake, or the fact that a modern government nearly fell in 1977 over the exact same issue that doomed a king 2 centuries earlier, let me know in the comments which one caught you off guard. And do me a favor and hit subscribe because we have a lot more stories like this one coming. Ordinary objects sitting quietly in your kitchen or your pocket right now that have, in their own way, quietly rewritten the course of human history. I will see you in the next one.